The first thing Elias Crow noticed was the silence, the kind that pressed against the ears like a held breath, stretching wide across the New Mexico plain just before dusk, when the sun sank low and painted the land the color of old blood and copper. His cabin sat alone near a dry arroyo, miles from the nearest settlement, a place he'd chosen because solitude had fewer questions and no witnesses. Elias was a cowboy by trade, a drifter by nature, and a man running from ghosts that wore familiar faces. He was mending a broken fence post when he saw her wagon, leaning crooked near the mesquite trees, one wheel sunk deep into soft earth, canvas torn and flapping like a wounded bird. She stood beside it, still as stone, watching him. An Apache woman, he knew it by the way she carried herself. Spine straight, eyes sharp, dark hair braided tight, wearing no fear like it had never been taught to her. One hand rested on a knife at her belt. The other held the reins of a thin, exhausted horse. Elias didn't reach for his rifle. He didn't speak. He only raised one hand slowly, palm open, and after a long moment she nodded once, a single motion heavy with meaning. He approached the wagon carefully, seeing the cracked axle, the split rim, damage that would leave anyone stranded overnight. "Wheel won't hold," he said quietly, more to the earth than to her. She answered in broken English, voice calm but edged like flint, "Dawn come." "I move then." He knew what that meant. Night here was not forgiving. Without another word, he fetched his tools. They worked side by side as the sun died. Not touching, not asking names. The air thick with unspoken histories. He noticed the faint traces of old scars along her forearms, the subtle markings on her leather pouch, symbols older than the maps he carried. She noticed how his hands never shook, how his eyes scanned the horizon even while working, how he kept his back to nothing. When darkness fell, he lit a lantern and offered water. She drank once, passed it back, and sat near the fire he built without being asked. Coyotes cried in the distance, and the wind whispered through dry grass like spirits arguing. "You stay?" he asked. She looked at the stars, then at him. "I stay." They spoke little through the night. She told him her name was Nalin, which meant the one who remains, and that she was traveling east to find kin after soldiers burned her village 2 winters ago. Elias said nothing of his past, only that he fixed things when they broke and left, before they could break again. Near dawn, the sky turning pale, he finished reinforcing the wheel well enough to carry her to the river trail. She thanked him with a nod, but before she could climb onto the wagon, a sound cut through the stillness. Hooves. Not one or two, many, fast. Elias turned, heart tightening, hand finally drifting toward his rifle. Out of the gray fog of morning, riders appeared on every rise. Apache warriors painted for war, faces streaked in blacken, red feathers tied to their hair, rifles and spears catching the early light. They circled his cabin in silence, perfectly spaced, perfectly controlled. No shouts, no chaos, just judgment. Nalin stepped forward, lifting her hand. The riders halted. She spoke sharply in Apache, words Elias couldn't understand, but the tone was command, not plea. One rider, older, his face carved by years and battle, dismounted and approached Elias, eyes cold and measuring. "You helped her," the man said in English thick with age. Elias nodded once. "She was stranded." The elder studied him like a blade studies flesh. "Many white men help only to take." Elias met his gaze. "I didn't." The circle tightened anyway. Horses stamping, tension snapping like wire. The elder raised his hand, and every rider leaned forward, awaiting the signal that would decide whether Elias Crow lived to see another sunrise. Behind him, his cabin stood small and defenseless, a symbol of a man who thought distance could save him. Nalin spoke again, louder this time, her voice cutting through the air like a drumbeat. The elder listened, jaw clenched, then looked back at Elias with something new in his eyes. Not mercy, not kindness, but recognition. "The dawn brings truth," he said, "and truth brings debt." As the riders remained unmoving, Elias realized this was no ambush. It was a reckoning, and whatever choice the Apache made this morning would bind his life to theirs in blood. Honor or both. Dawn broke fully now, spilling pale gold across the plains, and with it came the weight of a decision. Elias Crow could feel settling into his bones like an old ache, because the riders did not disperse when the sun rose, did not shout or threaten, but waited in a silence so complete it felt louder than gunfire. And the elder, whose name Elias learned was Taza, keeper of war memory, circled him once, slow and deliberate, as if tracing the outline of a life that might soon be erased. While Nalin stood between them, her posture unbending, her eyes reflecting the sky. And when Taza finally spoke again, he did not speak of death, but of balance, of how the world tipped when one hand helped another without asking for payment, and how such acts created obligations that could not be ignored, especially now when soldiers pressed harder into Apache land and scouts reported wagons of rifles moving south, because help, Taza said, was never small in times like these. It was a spark, and sparks either warmed the night or burned the world. Elias listened without interrupting, knowing instinctively that words offered too quickly were seen as weakness. And when Taza asked him why he had helped Nalin, Elias answered with the plain truth, that a broken wheel meant death out here, and that leaving her would have been the same as pulling the trigger himself. And something shifted in the circle then, a murmur like wind through grass, as the riders exchanged glances, because truth spoken simply was a language they respected. Taza nodded once and turned to Nalin, who removed the leather pouch from her belt and poured a small pile of red earth into her palm, marking Elias's forehead with a single streak, a sign, she explained quietly, that he had been seen by the people, and that once seen, a man was no longer invisible to fate. The riders did not leave after that. Instead, they dismounted, some tending horses, others watching the horizon, and Elias realized this was not a threat but a shelter, because before midday, dust rose in the west, and with it came the distant crack of rifle fire, soldiers probing careless and loud, and Taza's hand went up again, warriors melting into cover with a grace that turned fear into awe. And Elias found himself pulled into it, handed a rifle with unfamiliar markings, positioned behind a low rise where the earth smelled sharp and alive. The skirmish was brief and brutal, a lesson rather than a battle. And when it ended, the soldiers retreated, confused and blooded, leaving the land quiet once more. And Elias understood then that helping Nalin had drawn him into a war that had been circling him long before he ever saw her wagon. That night, as fires burned low and stories were shared in murmured Apache, Taza sat with Elias and spoke of debts repaid not with coin, but with courage, of a coming winter that would be hard, and of choices that would shape more than one man's fate. And Elias, staring into the flames, felt the ghosts he'd been running from finally catch up, not to condemn him, but to ask him who he intended to be when the next dawn came. Nalin joined him before sleep, her voice soft, telling him he could still leave, that the mark on his forehead would fade, but that some marks were carried inside and never washed away. And Elias knew, as the stars wheeled overhead and the land breathed around them, that his life as a man who fixed things and moved on was ending, replaced by something harder, truer, and bound by honor rather than fear. And as the riders mounted at first light to move deeper into the hills, Elias saddled his horse beside them, not because he was forced, but because he chose to ride toward what he had tried so long to outrun.